I'm not sure if I'm alone in this feeling, but I can't help but feel a glint of pride whenever I see my name somewhere in public. I still look through the novelty license plates whenever I find myself in a gift shop, or maybe when I'm reading a book and then, hey, that's my name. I think what it is that for 1 second, I'm known by someone who shouldn't know me. There's a brief moment where I can imagine that someone else has found this keychain or read this book, and they know that I exist. It's a weird thought, and I'm not even entirely sure that's why I like finding my name, but I've always had that moment of excitement, even when I was younger. When I was in elementary school, my family traveled to Washington, D.C. We went there a few times, actually. I remember going up into the Washington Monument and standing in front of a giant industrial fan because it was so hot outside. I remember going to the Jefferson Memorial, except it was so windy that I had trouble staying upright. And I remember finding my name, my last name. It's on a wall with 58,318 other names. They're the names of individuals who died in the Vietnam War. My great-uncle, Jan Rauschkolb, is on that wall. But as I've been researching him and his life for this episode, one thing has become crystal clear. I should not have found his name on that wall. Jan Rauschkolb should not have died in the Vietnam War. This is The Hunt for Gold. There are 4 voices in this story. 2 that I had to find, 1 that I already had the number for, and 1 that was given to me. The first voice I had to find was a woman named Mary Ann. It's where this whole thing started. "50 years after Jan died, Mary Ann Lebold left a comment on Jan's memorial page. It was titled, 'Still in My Heart After 50 Years. It starts with, "I remember our time together during the days before you left for your service." She then mentions the 2 of them having fun, receiving letters from him, and owning the same car brand Jan had mentioned wanting. The letter ends by saying, "I have had a good life, but I always wonder how it would have been had you and I shared our lives as I had hoped. We will meet again, Mary Ann." When I first came across this post, it felt almost like I had stumbled into something private, and yet I was very curious. Who was this woman? How exactly did she know Jan? And most importantly, was there a story here? Was Jan killed in the midst of a romance that had been quietly kept alive for the last 5 decades? And so I searched her name. It's an oddly ominous feeling, typing in the name of a person you aren't sure is still alive. Mary Ann had posted a second time to Jan's page 4 years later, but I was even 2 years removed from that. And the first result when you search Mary Ann Lebold is an obituary, but it's not hers. The problem is that Mary Ann Lebold has a very small digital footprint, so Google supplies the names of several other people instead. The only tangible thing I could find was a few submissions to a newspaper based in Washington called General Aviation News. Jan enlisted in the military in Denver, Colorado, but he grew up in Washington. At this point, I had been searching on and off again for 4 months, and the only thing that I had was a woman posting to an online newspaper in the same general geographic area as Jan's youth. That was until I looked deeper into Mary Ann's love of planes. Several pages deep into Google's search results was a forum post advertising an antique airplane event. The ad was from 2009, but it did have a phone number.
Hi, this is Mary Ann. Please leave a message.
Hi, Mary Ann. My name's Ethan Rauschkolb.
Jan met Mary Ann in December of 1968, 1 month before he shipped off for Vietnam. Mary Ann told me this after she returned my call 4 hours later.
I was going to Portland State University, and there was a group of guys that I palled around with, and Jan was visiting in Portland.
The group got snowed in downtown Portland.
We we had a lot of fun. And Jen was part of the group, and we just hit it off.
But despite her telling me these memories, Marianne did reiterate something to me more than once.
But, this is well over 50 years ago, so a lot of the details are pretty fuzzy.
She mostly had scattered memories, she said, like the last letter Jan sent her, where he mentioned wanting to get the same car brand Marianne spoke about in her memorial post. But she did have an answer for when I asked her what Jan was like.
He was an exceptional young man. He was well-educated, conservative, respectful, not a hard-drinking, woman-chasing party man. He was, in a word, perfect. And I was blessed.
If I'm being honest, I got the sense that there was more that she remembered of Jan. That maybe she had more specific details from their time snowed in together, but that she wanted to keep them private. And she wrote Jan enough that he mentioned her to his parents in letters. He said she wrote him almost daily. She even sent him brownies. But when I asked her about what kind of letters she sent to Jan,
I really don't remember. We were probably writing about the things that 20 and 21-year-olds talk about.
Which is fair. I'm not sure I'd want a stranger to read my text messages either. But there was one thing that Marianne remembered clearly. It was 1969, Memorial Day weekend, after Jan had left for Vietnam.
Memorial Day weekend, I took the bus up to Portland and was spending the weekend with some girlfriends. And Bruce Free, and I believe Mike, wanted to come over and visit with us.
Those two men were with Jan during their visit the year before.
And for some reason, I was sitting on the floor in their living room, and the two fellows were sitting on a couch. But there was a certain heaviness. And then finally, they just blurted out that he had died.
When I first heard that story, I assumed the heaviness in the air was just the general notion that Jan had died, which in part it was, but the timeline sheds a little bit more light. Memorial Day in 1969 was on May 30th. Jan died on May 25th. It had been less than a week. Marianne says she lost the summer of '69. She never reached out to Jan's family, she was told not to by a friend, and so she grieved alone. And the Rauschkolb family forgot the name Marianne. Which brings me to voice number 2, the one I already had the number for.
Hello?
Hello?
Yep, hello.
How's it going?
This is Frank Rauschkolb, Jan's younger brother. When I asked him if he'd heard of Marianne all the way back at the beginning of my research, he had said no, which made more sense after Marianne said she never contacted the family. But Frank was able to tell me other important pieces of the puzzle. Frank joined the war a year earlier than Jan did in 1967. His family had just moved from Washington to Colorado.
I worked as a busboy in a restaurant, and then I got a notice in the mail, said Uncle Sam would like to see you on this date to take a physical.
There were over 2 million men drafted into the Vietnam War. Frank was not technically one of them. Draft notices came with a specific date you had to show up for. In between receiving the letter and that date, you could voluntarily enlist.
I went around trying to get into anything but the Marines and the Army. So I went to recruiters.
Frank was not the first to come up with this idea. A surplus of enlistments for both the Navy and Air Force meant a multi-year waiting period. So Frank did the next best thing. He enlisted in the Army, where he was told he would go to Germany. Frank trained in radio for the final months of 1967.
That was right at Christmas time or right after Christmas, and I got orders for Vietnam.
Frank left for Saigon that winter.
Day I left for Vietnam, 68, Brother Jan was there. He had come home to say goodbye to me because he knew I was going to Vietnam, and I didn't know this, but he planned to join the Marine Corps.
This is the first point in the episode where you can see the story of Jan's life take a turn towards May 25th. I mentioned at the beginning that Jan should not have died in Vietnam. But this statement is more literal than what people often say about the war. Jan's draft number was over 200, which makes it very possible that he never would have been drafted into the war in the first place.
I wish I would have been able to talk to him about it, but he was gung-ho Marine, and there was nothing I could have done to change his mind, probably.
But like Jan tended to do, he had his mind made up and he enlisted. Which lets me introduce the third voice in this story, Jan. Brother Jan, like most men in the Vietnam War, wrote letters whenever he could. Marianne, as far as I know, didn't keep the letters they wrote. Frank, too, didn't seem to keep the letters he and Jan sent back and forth, but Jan's mom did, and Frank sent me those. Mary Ann is mentioned 3 times in Jan's letters, twice for the amount of letters she was sending him, and once because she sent brownies. Frank is mentioned 8 times, mostly to say they've written each other, but once to say they were stationed close together, and once to say he saw a sign with the number of Frank's battalion. Jan avoiding deployment in Vietnam is mentioned 10 times. Which brings us to the next piece of the Jan puzzle. Even though he enlisted into the Marines, Jan was not deployed to Vietnam. Instead, he was stationed in Camp Pendleton, California, one of the biggest hubs for military training during the Vietnam War. On April 26th, Jan wrote to his parents to tell them his new address within the camp. That's the first letter we have record of. It's also the start of a very difficult read. Jan's letters to his parents are some of the most effective pieces of slow burn horror that I've ever consumed. On the surface, they're a fascinating look into Jan's time in the military. He talks about eating sea rations during boot camp, humping mountains in Vietnam, staying up late in foxholes or tents, his buddies, his clothes, a camera, his truck, Marianne, Frank. And then every once in a while, you're hit with the sudden but undeniable fact that you're reading the letters of a young man who didn't know he was about to die. And sometimes it's like you're watching a movie and you just want to yell at the screen and tell the girl not to walk into the house at night. Like Jan's second letter to his parents, where he says he was given a paper asking if he wanted to be assigned somewhere other than Vietnam. In response, Jan said, "I feel guilty about it, not serving my country at a time of need." Those words are really devastating to see on paper. Jan spent most of 1968 at Camp Pendleton working a clerical job. In that time, he would work on getting deferment from Vietnam on the grounds that his brother Frank was in the DMZ at the time. This was not an unheard of arrangement. Early in the summer, Jan says he would probably be stationed in Hawaii or Japan, but the inkling that he could do more was there from the beginning. On December 5th, 1968, he wrote to his parents saying, "I know you'll be sorry to hear this, but I've made up my mind to get out of here. I'll be home for Christmas," he says, "and then I'll be shipped off." He tries to quell his parents' fear in the same letter, saying he'll really only be out there for 8 or 9 months. But there's that feeling again. The one where you want to shout at the screen and tell him to turn back. Because at that point, Jan was 6 months away from May 25th, 1969.
You want to know how he died? Was he left his place of protection in a foxhole and went to help out this crew of mortarmen that their mortar pit caught fire from the enemy and been shooting mortars at him.
Jan was not killed by enemy gunfire. Instead, he was killed, along with 14 other men, by a mortar that detonated in an ammo pit. Frank told me the story of Jan's death. You can also find the official military account of the event on Jan's Vietnam memorial page. But on another, more obscure memorial website, a man named Scott Harriet posted a message. In it, he said he was there when Jan died. And so I emailed him. Or rather, I found an email that connected me with Scott's wife, who then gave me his number. I asked Scott if he would be available to call me, but unfortunately he could not. He's got cancer related to Agent Orange, an herbicide used heavily during the Vietnam War that's been linked to a significant amount of health problems. And so, through text and frequent breaks when Scott needed them, he recounted the events of May 25th. The 3rd Marines were coming off an extremely successful mission. They had ambushed a very large group of enemy soldiers as they were filling up their canteens at the river. Jan's job was a scout, and he wrote to his parents that he was in charge of searching the bodies. The dead were nothing but kids, Jan wrote, about 16. The POWs were 18. As he was writing that letter, Scott Harriet was on a reconnaissance mission, leading about a dozen men. But Scott said he was worried about calling in for backup, so he turned the group around. After he did, Scott says the group was hit with artillery. They picked up their pace after the first bombardment, and they made it back to base by the time the second wave began to rain down. Scott says he had hunkered down in a foxhole with a radio operator. At some point, he thought he heard someone call out fire, and then, later, the phrase, "It's going to blow." I placed myself inside the bunker, Scott says, and it did blow. I was underground, and it felt like something had a hold of me and was shaking me. My vision began to narrow, and I almost lost consciousness. An entire pallet of 80mm mortar rounds had gone off at once. Jan was one of 15 men who died in the explosion. 2 of the men were never found. They had been vaporized when the pallet went off. In his letter, written just hours before the explosion, Jan says his brother Frank was excited to learn they were stationed only 15 miles apart.
I could hear that explosion from where I was.
Frank would not learn that the sound he heard was Jan's death until 3 days later. When he got back from patrol, Frank says he was called into his sergeant's office where he was told to take a seat.
And I knew right then that what happened. And even at the read telegram, I knew.
Frank flew home the next morning, and even though he can't prove it, he says he flew back with Jan. He says this because the plane that shuttled him home also contained dozens of caskets, all of them draped with the American flag. Later that year, the men in that plane, including Jan, would be featured in a Life magazine issued titled "The Faces of the American Dead, 1 Week's Toll." In the issue are the names and faces of 242 men killed in 1 week of the Vietnam War. There have been a few moments during my research that have made me cry. The first time was reading Jan's memorial page. Frank left the first comment on the page in 1999. He talks about missing his big brother, about taking one last look for Jan whenever he's fishing, and it ends with the phrase, "Love you always." That made me cry. The second time was when I was texting with Scott, and he told me he never had a brother, but if he could have chosen one, it would have been Jan. But I cried the hardest looking at the 12-page spread in Life magazine, because it was then that 2 different things became clear. First, that Jan should not have been in there. In all likelihood, he never would have been drafted, but he enlisted. He could have avoided being stationed in Vietnam, but he chose to go. And in Vietnam, he wasn't killed by enemy gunfire or an ambush. He was killed trying to put out a fire on an ammunition pallet. It was all just avoidable. But the second thing that struck me was the fact that Jan was not alone. In 1 week, Life tallied 242 names of men who died. Most of them were around 20 years old. Jan was 22. However, over 58,000 casualties were reported by the US military. And it's devastating, really, to contemplate that death. Jan can be found in the article more than once, though. At the end, there's a short written segment titled "I See Death Coming Up the Hill." The name is taken from a letter written by another US soldier who wrote home that as enemy forces approached, he saw death coming up the hill. In the article, it's mentioned that a man from Colorado, in his final letter, wrote about preferring to use the same mortars that would get him killed that same day. That was Jan Rauschkolb, writing to his folks back home that his Marine Corps preferred the Vietnamese 60mm firing tube. He wrote this after only 4 months in Vietnam and only a couple hours before the explosion. Marianne mentioned to me that the saddest part about the whole affair was that Jan never got to live the life before him. And I think that touches on the greater tragedy of the whole story. The final thing that Jan wrote to his parents on May 25th was, "Don't worry, I'll be coming home soon." It's the final piece of dramatic irony that pervades Jan's letters. But it's fitting, at least in a poetic sense, that Jan's final letter ended by looking to the future, the same future that left him behind. I haven't been able to find a great moral in Jan's story. I haven't found peace in his death. I haven't come to terms with the inevitability of dying or the futile nature of the Vietnam conflict. I don't really know what to make of the consistency in which Jan's decisions put him closer to the front lines. And to be honest, the entire hook of this episode, that Jan's name shouldn't be on the wall, has ended with more of a sad whimper than a bang. Yeah, his name shouldn't be up there, but it is, and that's the reality we have to live with. I did lie about one thing, though. It's easy to miss, but technically, Jan's last letter didn't end saying he'd be home soon. Instead, it ended with the same phrase he ended every letter with, all 26 of them. Love, comma, Jan. And maybe that's a more concrete through line for this episode. Love, Jan, is what they did. His parents poured their hearts into the Oregon Vietnam Veterans Memorial in honor of Jan. Scott Harriet carries the memory of the brother he never had to this day. Frank has kept the letters safe for all this time and says he thinks about Jan every day. And Marianne still has him in her heart after 50 years. To quote the issue of Life that Jan appears in, which came out 1 month after his death, "Such fragments on film, in letters, in clippings, and in recollection comprise the legacies of virtually every man shown in these pages. To study the smallest portion of them, even without reference to their names, is to glimpse the scope of a much broader tragedy." This is The Hunt for Gold,